One thing to understand about the overhead squat assessment is that it is an assessment squat. So I purposely put you in an anatomical position where the feet are more narrow than what you would do in a working squat. That's only to assess any imbalances or issues that we see in the squat. Now, when you go to regularly squat in the gym, feet are going to be slightly wider, about shoulder width apart, and you're actually going to toe out about 15 to 30 degrees depending on the person and what you're comfortable with. Now, for a mechanically efficient and proper squat, there are two things that are simultaneously happening. The first is that my knees bend. And at the same time, my hips go back slightly. This is done with your feet flat on the ground throughout the whole squat. Imagine there's a string in front of your hips that pulls them back slightly when you begin the squat. Also imagine there's a string behind the knees that pulls the knees forward when you squat. Done at the same time, that's what the beginning of your squat's gonna look like. And ideally, for a full squat, at the top of the thighs parallel to the ground or slightly above. That's gonna depend mostly on a person's mobility and training age. Top of the thighs parallel to the ground is ideal and the goal, but that doesn't mean every single person needs to do it, because you don't want to squat parallel and then have the body compensate in order to do so. Another aspect that I want to talk about is what your knees do in a squat. As the knees bend and the hips bend, descend into your squat, you want to drive the knees out slightly. The big mistake you want to avoid is the inner collapse of the knee called knee valgus. Sometimes both of the knees collapse or just one knee collapses. This is usually a result of the glute medius muscle not externally rotating the hip properly. The reason it's bad and we want to avoid it because for every 10% of knee valgus that happens, we're putting about 100% of pressure on our ACL and we increase our risk for injury. Now, I'm not saying an injury is going to happen every time. It just increases the risk, especially when you start loading your squat. Yeah. Too much of something can be a bad thing. For example, I drive my knees out excessively, which causes me to rock to the outside of my feet. This again distributes the load unevenly across my body. And because of the uneven weight distribution in my feet, I become again unstable in my squat. We want to drive the knees out, but we want to be able to keep weight evenly across the tripod foot. Brings me to my next point in squatting. What is the tripod foot? The tripod is 3 points on your foot. First, near the knuckle of the big toe, second, near the knuckle of the outside toe, and the third is the heel, connecting into a tripod or a triangle shape. And when you squat, you always want to make sure those 3 points maintain contact with the ground. If your heels and things like that pop up, it shows that you have an ankle problem and probably some tight calves and you need to do some stretching and foam rolling work. Now let's talk about the most important aspect of any squat or hinge pattern, and that is bracing your core. This is often underutilized and underlooked in human movement. The concept of bracing your core is kind of like preparing for a punch. If you knew someone was about to punch you in the stomach, you would brace for that. You'd kind of hold your breath. It's a little more than that. This is how you properly brace your core. I'm going to start with this 360 breathing drill. It's going to take some time to practice because pretty much most of us breathe improperly, including myself. So how you're going to do it is you're going to find your hip bone. Then you're going to find the bottom of your rib cage. Then you're going to place your fingers in between those two spots on the soft part of your torso. Squeeze your stomach inward. Now from here, you're going to practice taking some deep breaths. When you inhale, you want your torso and your belly to expand. You want to get full 360 back, body, and side expansion. As you can see, when I inhale, air goes into my diaphragm and my abdomen, and that air pushes my fingers outward. And when I exhale, I let the air out, fingers go back inward. A lot of us have breathing backwards. So you want to make sure you practice this pattern. Kind of hold that brace breath as you squat. Slowly let air up on the way up. Take that breath at any time. Now, why am I emphasizing this? Why is bracing the core when you squat or hinge so important? When we're able to brace and stabilize the core, we're able to keep the spine in a neutral position throughout human movement. This doesn't just apply in the gym. This applies everywhere in life. If we don't practice bracing our core, especially under load, the spine becomes unstable. Again, increases our risk of injury. Now, it's important to understand the difference between a squatting pattern like you see here. We squat in the gym, but think about it. We squat in everyday life. Every single time you get up and down off the toilet, every time you get in and out of the car, and anytime you sit and get up from a chair, you are in fact squatting. Now, the movement that you see me do here is called a hinging pattern. It's primarily a pattern where we hinge at the hip. Properly hip hinge, keep your feet flat on the ground. You want to imagine like you're shutting a car door with your butt. Push your butt and your hips backwards with a slight soft knee bend, keeping the feet flat. You don't want the toes to pop up off the ground. If the toes pop up off the ground, you reach the end of your mobility limit, and the reason you don't want that to happen is because the core becomes unstable at that point. So to properly hip hinge, you should feel your glutes and your hamstrings feel a stretching sensation. How far down you hinge will primarily depend on your mobility limit. Now, a common mistake people make when hinging is they hip hinge back and they think they can go further, so then they start bending at the spine. We don't want this at all. We do this all the time, even outside the gym when they're picking stuff up. Spine rounds. We don't want that to happen, especially if we're picking something up or loading anything. We want the movement to come about the hips while the back stays straight or the spine stays neutral. While doing the proper upper core brace from earlier always applies. Now the deadlift that you see here is primarily a hip hinging pattern. Notice how my back and my spine stay neutral, moving about the hips. Now this is an advanced movement, and I don't start new clients here. It takes months to build up to this and do it properly. I have plenty of clients who don't even do a barbell deadlift anymore. You gotta learn to hinge correctly. Same thing with a loaded back squat. I don't start new clients with a load on their back, especially in month one. We work up to and build proper squatting mechanics. There are tons of ways to load a squat. Look at how these hip hinging patterns apply in real life. For example, just picking something off of the ground. Child, grocery bags, something you dropped, whatever it might be. Watch how I brace my core, breathing outward, holding the brace breath, keeping my back straight, and picking the item up. One tip that you can do here is use your free hand to post on your thigh. This gives you somewhat of a stable frame and helps brace better. So look how I put my hand on my thigh, or you can place your forearm on your thigh. Your brace breath, move about the hips, and pick the item up properly. This applies everywhere. Let me give you some tips for bracing in the gym. As simple as getting a dumbbell off of the rack. The thing is making sure you step to the rack and you're not far away from it. If I decide to pick these dumbbells with my body far away like you see here, there's a big torque angle between my body and the weights. So you want to step closer. Or like we talked about earlier, and pick the weights off of the rack. Or if you're just getting one dumbbell, use that free hand to brace on the rack or your body and pick the weight off. Watch how I set it down. Placing my free hand on my knee, hand or forearm so that I can brace, keeping my spine neutral while I set it down. Same thing when picking it up. Do this not only in the gym, but everywhere that you pick items off of the ground. Here's another example of bracing before I go and do an exercise. On the ground, I get them really close to my feet. Hard to see here, but I am bracing my core, preparing to pick these weights up off of the ground as I bend forward. And then I place them on top of my thighs. And as I go back to do my dumbbell chest press, I hoist them up one leg at a time to help get the weight where I need it, and then we can begin our exercise.